Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you again for everyone that enabled me to be here. I have two small disclaimers before I start. One is that unfortunately I'm here on my own and Daniel couldn't join me, so whenever you get tired of my voice in the next 20-25 minutes, just imagine there's another bearded guy standing next to me and we're doing this in like a perfect unison and it's like all really jumpy and great. And so this is the first disclaimer. The second one is that we have like, okay, thank you. The second one is that cooking sections, the practice that we established 5 years ago, is not a curatorial practice. Especially after hearing in the past few days really incredible curators that are doing wonderful work. I would not claim that space in any way, but within this misfit in this panel, I hope that we can kind of start an interesting discussion. So I'm going to talk about the Empire Remains Shop, a project that we done last summer in London. Timber from Burma, lamb from New Zealand, fruit from Cyprus, fish from Nigeria, sugar from Mauritius, cotton from Uganda. Jungles today are gold mines of tomorrow. These series of images of global capital and food trade were produced by the Empire Marketing Board in the 1920s to encourage British citizens to consume foodstuff from the colonies and overseas territories. Under the intensive visual propaganda reminding how empire buyers are empire builders, the British government tried to boost trade through marketing foodstuff that were cultivated all across the empire. The colonial planet became the supermarket for consumers who took availability of produce as a given. At the same time, this circulation of exotic tropical items also introduced a new series of stimulating substances for the bourgeoisie and the workers alike, whereby vitamins, caffeine, nicotine, chocolate, and sugar not only enhanced pleasure, but boosted productivity in factories by making the human body dependent on energetic and relaxing substances. The fact that citizens could not experience in the flesh the production sites of those foodstuff made them believe in the construction of a new world imaginary. This propaganda in the form of posters, film, and recipes was efficient because of the geographical gap it constructed between two realities. A relative proximity to a site of tropical foodstuff and a relative distance to the abusive and violent labor conditions to produce those same products. The planet was transformed into a highway connecting and disjointing sites of productions from site of consumption. Colonies in that regard were depicted as sites whereby inhabitants and wilderness had to be tamed, while the more civilized dominions were organized by strict geometric order. And here you see two examples. On your left is a poster called Sugar in Barbados, where kind of the human body and the sugarcane are kind of entwined in this kind of image of wilderness. And on your right, you have oranges in South Africa, where the human body is completely absent, and the worker kind of, its absence in that image, kind of in this fashionably ordered orchards of oranges, kind of assume a technology that is kind of making all of this production of foodstuff just happen. Buy Empire Every Day reminded the Empire Marketing Board posters to pedestrians in London in the 1920s and 30s. The responsibility of the economy of the nation was no longer a matter of the government, but it was transferred onto the people and their consumption habits. If you don't buy and the national project collapses, it is you that is responsible. Empire shops were planned to be open in London in the 1930s, and they intended to make sultanas from Australia, oranges from Palestine, cloves from Zanzibar, and rum from Jamaica available and familiar in the British Isles. Through a series of empire recipes and empire produce, the shop aimed to push people to buy cinnamon or nutmeg, but also indoctrinate them on how to use them. None of the shops ever managed to open, as the economic system of tariffs was introduced and the idea of an empire shop became redundant. After an extensive research period that spanned over 3 years to track the contemporary legacy of food infrastructure put in place by the British Empire, we opened the first empire shop last year. Instead of selling products from the empire remains shop speculated on the possibility and implications of selling back the remains of the British Empire in London today. Over its 3 months of duration between Brexit vote and Trump's election, it employed food as a tool to question current forms of power while aiming to dismantle geographies, origins, and exchanges across the present and future of our post-colonial planet. We invited over 40 contributors to respond to the still present remains of empire power structures, drawing together performances, academic papers, dinners, trips, sonic nights, or culinary provocations. Each contribution responding to the implications of selling the remains of empire today. To overcome limitations of duration and discipline, contributors operated through different agendas. And this, I believe, is a very important point in light of the discussions we were having here in the past days. As instead of working through ideas, for instance, of geographies or region, definitions that still, in the way kind of we think about this, assume a very oppressive and colonial rule within them. What was interesting to us is to see how political, economic, social, spatial, or artistic agenda of each contribution can be the point of departure to think of alliances and frictions that can emerge within and beyond this platform. The Empire Remains shop traced the construction of landscapes, imaginaries, economies, and aesthetics derived from trading imperial foodstuff in order to critically think of political counterstructures for the more evenly distributed, hyper-globalized world. In that regard, the Empire Remains shop was used as a method to understand the space in which power structures operate and explore how to use that as a field and opportunity to simultaneously change them. And here, this is a work that kind of was the motto of the Empire Remains shop and was hanging above. It's a neon piece titled By the Rumor, Sell the News, which was done by Asuncion Molinos, which was mentioned on the first day. This recipe, so this is an example of a recipe, this recipe of the Empire Christmas pudding from 1928 was made and distributed by the Empire Marketing Board. It links a series of 17 ingredients with 17 different geographies, geographic locations across the board, the globe. Currants from Australia, cinnamon from India, nutmeg from the British West Indies, cloves from Zanzibar, and apples from Canada. But more than a recipe, this list of ingredients operates for us as a map. The Empire Remains Christmas pudding tracked the changes that have occurred in post-colonial food market by exploring the economic strategies and the forces that are at play. Sourcing the same list of ingredients from supermarkets all across London, we tried to track whether these ingredients were still being produced in the same geographies. The Empire Remains Christmas pudding made evident that if once foodstuff were promoting a specific origin, today majority of food is actually packed in the UK, milled in the UK, produced in the EU, using sugar from a range of countries or being Demerara inspired, instead of actually Demerara produced. The new economies of origin are not about the promotion of place, but actually the erasure of it. In that regard, the dissolution of origin has shifted the logic from made in to made nowhere. A series of spaces in former colonies have emerged out of the financial extraction of value, no longer agricultural, but economies based on a place that does not need soil fertility to cultivate produce. Instead, there are places whose value depend on the disconnected economy. These offshore economies are epitomized by building like this one, the Ogland House, here in the Cayman Islands, where almost 20,000 global firms are registered in the same address, all in this 4-story building. And I think for us, this idea of the offshore is extremely important in our work, because I think as cultural practitioners or artists or whatever we want to call ourselves, we are constantly trying to operate beyond the norm. And actually, looking at the offshore as a space of exterritoriality, I think for us is extremely important to see what kind of opportunities that can give us, right? And how we can use these political and economic methods to really expand the possibilities and kind of the constructions we are all the time kind of operating within. So following these new spatial and economic structures that emerged from the imperial legacy, this presentation is structured around 3 notions to explore possible future scenarios that could disrupt the violent logic of perpetual circulation and accumulation of capital and others' ways of thinking about the built environment, devaluing and degrowth. In July 2013, lab technician Kenneth McRae murdered his wife Jane in the Midlands after killing himself in the West Midlands. He went mad after finding out that Japanese knotweed was growing on his site, spreading from the nearby golf course into his property, but no knotweed was found in the property after the fatal murder. Last year, William Jones hanged himself after being notified that the land he owned had Japanese knotweed growing on it. Japanese knotweed and other non-native species have been put at the forefront of a war against non-human invaders in Northern Europe and especially in the UK. They have been accused of taking over the land, private property and public grounds, houses and old factories, gardens and forests, highways and waterways, any ways in which a plant appears everywhere. Much before people started to take their own life in their hands, the British government allocated enormous budgets to try and solve this problem. The problem, plants from elsewhere invade us here. The total cost to handle Japanese knotweeds and other invaders for the British taxpayer is around £200 million a year. It is estimated that the yearly global expenditure on mitigation and eradication programs exceeds $1.8 trillion. In the 2000s, Japanese knotweed turned from a horticultural problem into a mediatic event. Journals, newspapers, and tabloids all reported the Great Invasion. The garden invader that can sink your mortgage. The plant that ate Britain. Not in my backyard. At war with aliens. Panic was not caused by the presence of Japanese knotweed. It was banks and credit institutions who made people panic. Any trace of Japanese knotweed in one's private property would likely result in the refusal to grant a mortgage. Real estate market and property value were victimized through the threat of a plant. And a new industry of fear was born. For the construction of the subjective taxonomies of native and non-native, pseudo-objective thresholds are to be demarcated. Science and politicians need to determine the precise time an alien plant arrived or when it became naturalized. The amount of years that a species has inhabited a certain place should be enough to determine its degree of belonging. But what is the threshold? Is it 3 years? 30 years, 300 years, 3,000 years, 30,000 years? Over the past 2 centuries, the planet has experienced an incomparable movement of species across the globe. If we were to consider a longer time frame or perspective, most native flora could be actually referred to as alien invaders. Not only did the definition Yes. Not only the definition of native or non-native is challenging, but the association of the alien as a negative agent plays a crucial role in that distinction. Japanese knotweed has been stigmatized for two main reasons. A, it has been declared a non-native invasive plant which depends on the construction of a demarcated national sovereignty operating within a certain time frame. And B, it has been portrayed to have the capabilities to penetrate through the foundations of any house. Yet, there is no evidence for its capabilities to grow through concrete, and like many plants, it would find any crack to surface. The next invasive is native, rethinks the alien as an entity that actually constructs a new reality and brings a valuable hybridization. As part of it, we started an archive of properties in the UK that have been devalued by Japanese knotweeds. At the Empire Remains shop, we opened the Devaluing Property Real Estate Agency to think, what is the agency of a plant in challenging the real estate market lobby in a city like London? Installed in our shop window, the Devaluing Property Real Estate Agency replicated the all too familiar aesthetics of the real estate window displays in central London. Hundreds of people stopped by the window to look at our assets. Some engaged with the topic, others ridiculed it, and others became infuriated for playing with such serious business and an established pillar of society. After a half-hour consultation on how to devalue property through Japanese knotweed, very similar to what you're experiencing now, customers were served the plant that could sink your mortgage ice cream. A recipe that incorporates and embraces Japanese knotweed as part of a post-industrial city ecosystem, showing one of the many ways the prolific growth of the plant can be put into use rather than fighting it through million-dollar pesticide programs. Recipes for food sovereignty. The installation and performance 55-gallon creates another reference for blue curry. So, the installation and performance 55 gallons creates a new typological hybrid. Blue Curry's all-in-one barbecue and steel drum ensemble explores tourist cliches of cultural artifacts, fusing their characteristics, heat and sound, into a single transformative moment. Musicians and the general public could book a rehearsal slot during the 2 weeks 55 gallons occupied our storefront. In the lineage of how drums and calypso have been a communication device and political tool, we commissioned a new verse, The Empire Strikes Again, written and performed by G-String. A barbecue on the beach and a steel drum serenade are now examples of the tropes of the tropics that tourists expect and demand when visiting the islands. Cheapened and watered down, these traditions have been dislocated from their rich histories purely out of economic interest. Recent attempts to replicate Trinidad and Tobago's pre-Lenten carnival celebrations all over the Caribbean, according to dates that match tourist vacation calendars, exemplify exactly that. The piece, working through different notions of sovereignty, was performed while Blue himself was grilling cassava, plantain, and breadfruit, foodstuff and not any meat, chicken or whatnot. Foodstuff that need to become much larger stakeholders in the local food systems in Caribbean nation states to work towards a state of food sovereignty. New climatic seasons. In 1916, the Middle East was divided in two between the British and the French counterparts with the Sykes-Picot agreements. Since the opening of the Palestine potash mine in British Mandatory Palestine, the extraction of fertilizers from the Dead Sea has made that landscape one of the top 7 potash extraction sites in the world. Aiming to solve a global shortage of food, the hyper-fertilization of the soil worldwide has created spaces where utter destruction is legitimized in order to solve world's famine, but also to allow us to consume strawberries any time of year. Since the early 2000s, the Dead Sea level has dropped a meter a year, and you can see the succession here in the images of how the sea has basically been shrinking and the tailing ponds at the bottom where the salt and potash is being extracted. With its surface of the earth has not only entered a state of permanent risk of subsidence, but it has also literally created over 5,000 sinkholes along its depleting shores. These sinkholes have taken over the unique desert landscape, some large as 2 kilometers long and 25-meter deep. Water runoff from the desertified mountains seeps into the ground where the sea once lay, dissolving underground deposits of rock salt and creating huge cavities that eventually surrender to the weight of the earth on top of them. Driving along the banks of the Dead Sea, the sight of abandoned beaches and beach resorts, empty buildings, and diverted roads amidst the arid landscape feels like an apocalypse in the lowest place on earth. The main force accountable for this radical transformation is the extraction of fertilizers from the evaporation ponds run by the Dead Sea Works in Israel and the Arab Potash Company in Jordan. Under the Sea There Is a Hole is an installation that explores other ways to reduce the need for adding nutrients to the soil while still feeding a growing population. As a setting, a series of 25 suspending dining surfaces map out over 5,000 sinkholes that exist today in the Dead Sea. On top of them, a Climavore performative dinners take place. Climavore aims to consider a diet based on new climatic seasons, different from the now obsolete cycles of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Climatic events may span over days, months, years, or centuries. Climavore sets out to frame the new season of food production and consumption that are appearing due to those human-induced climatic events. It reacts to current drought, desertification, water pollution, flash flood, or invasive species. Climavore investigates how to adapt our diet to a globally financialized landscape, what to eat during period of drought, and what to eat during period of severe scarcity of water or increased salinity of the soil. Climavore aims to develop a changing form of eating that functions as infrastructure. It questions the geopolitical implications behind the making of climate alterations and the pressures they enforce on local inhabitants. And I think we were doing research for this project 2 years ago, and as part of it, we visited here in the Cayman Islands, and I'm sure many of you are very well aware to the existence of lionfish here in the water, but for us, what was extremely interesting is how the Caymanian government and an organization here called CAL basically took lionfish and made it into what we kind of like to think about it as a national dish for the Cayman Islands. And what is interesting is a dish that they're really promoting in many, many restaurants, and I hope maybe tonight we'll have the chance to have lionfish. Well, yeah, that would be lovely. And because I know they serve it there when they have it, but and in that sense, I think it's a kind of what it brings forward here is this idea of cultural heritage with an expiration date, right? When we're thinking of climate change, this idea of food kind of traditions that have to be carried throughout centuries past from grandmother to son to daughter to etc., for us in many ways don't seem to operate in the same way anymore. And kind of with this dish, for instance, what is very interesting that you would eat lionfish now while you have this invasion, and the moment maybe sharks learn how to eat lionfish and there's the ecosystem rebalances itself, you will never eat another lionfish again in your life. As the Empire main shop closed its doors in November 2016, the afterlife of the project continues in the creation of a franchise agreement. In that way, the Empire main shop can open in other parts of the world as a platform to respond to post-colonial contexts elsewhere. British, but also Italian, Danish, Dutch, French, or Belgian, just to name a few. Using the research, work, and knowledge developed so far at the Empire Remains shop, the franchise is ready for institutions, collectives, or individuals to set up a counterpart and investigate the power structures still in place. The upcoming book that we are publishing this year with Columbia University Press will work both as a documentation and a manual of how this platform can respond and dismantle colonial infrastructures still permeating society in multiple geographies and locations. Thank you.